What a journey we've all been on since last Advent. For all of us, it's been a difficult 12 months. For many of us, it's been particularly rough. For some of us, it's been tragic and traumatic. Now, I'm going to spend the session today thinking about what our faith teaches us about waiting through our suffering, waiting through our suffering. Advent, of course, is a season of waiting for that future expectation, the birth of Jesus. But most of us don't enjoy having to wait for things. Perhaps the word wait is not so different from its homophone word weight, heaviness. There can be a heaviness about waiting. There's a story about a teacher picking up his glass of water and asking his students how heavy it is. And all sorts of answers are called out, ranging from a few ounces to 30 ounces. And the teacher then informs the class that the absolute weight of the glass of water has no bearing on his own experience of that weight. He says, the weight depends on how long I hold it. If I hold it for a minute, it's no problem at all. If I hold it for an hour, I have a slight ache in my arm. If I hold it for a day, then my whole arm will start to feel numb and paralyzed. In each case, he said, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes. The weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes. Sometimes, when we're waiting for something or someone, it can be frustrating. It can be wearisome. It can be like an ache in the arm. It can, for example, be a somewhat unpleasant experience when we're waiting in a queue in a supermarket, or we're waiting for a friend who's late once again. But waiting can also be far more serious and severe. Ultimately, waiting can weigh us down. It can be like carrying a heavy load for a long period. It can numb us. It can paralyze us when we're waiting for recovery from illness, for light to break through grief, for depression to lift, for test results, for the hurt of broken relationships to heal. So Advent is a season of waiting, but I'm now going to take us back to another great season of waiting. At the end of Lent, we enter the 3 days of the cross, the Triduum. As Christians, we remember that when we go through any period of suffering, big or small, we are participating in those 3 days of the cross. By doing so, we face the reality and pain of our own Good Friday. We dwell in the frustrations and darkness of Holy Saturday, and we search for those life-affirming glimpses of resurrection and hope in our Easter Sunday. Many of us who suffer, though, find ourselves stranded in the darkness of Holy Saturday. It's at those times we need to remind ourselves that at a time of waiting, however frustrating, is where resurrection is birthed. In the film adaptation of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas falls gravely ill. Edmund Bertram gingerly asks whether anything can be done. The answer comes, wait, for time can do almost anything. Wait, for time can do almost anything. Yet in our fast food, microwave meal world, waiting is seen as having little or no value. It so often seems just a frustrating waste of time. After all, we're taught from an early age that waiting constitutes dead time, which eats into our busy, constructive days. And during any dead time that we face, we feel that we always should be doing something more interesting, something more worthwhile. Now, as we juggle our busy schedules, the phrase multitasking has even become a badge of honor to be worn proudly in the overflow of our lives. We'll do anything to avoid wasting time. Now, in the context of suffering, the frustration of waiting is intensified, waiting for recovery from illness, waiting for depression to lift, waiting for light to break through grief, waiting for test results, we often fail to recognize that so-called dead time can actually be a time of great spiritual and personal growth. At the end of A.A. Milne's House at Pooh Corner, Christopher Robin grows up and he leaves his childhood toys and his childlike ways behind him. Pooh, he announces to his little bear, I'm not going to do nothing no more. Never again? Asks Pooh. Well, comes the answer, not so much. They don't let you. They don't let you. There's something profoundly true about that sentiment. Rarely, as adults, do people allow us just to do nothing. Rarely do people allow us just to be. We live in a culture of doing rather than being. And so achievements become our yardstick to success and growth, while doing nothing is just frowned upon. Life, growth, and movement are then inextricably linked in today's hectic world. The journalist Herb Cohen considered the gazelle and the lions on the plains of Africa. Every morning, he said, the gazelle wakes up and knows it has to run faster than the fastest lion or it will be killed. Every morning, the lion wakes up and knows it has to run faster than the slowest gazelle or it will starve to death. So, Cohen claims, whether we are lions or gazelles, when the sun comes up, we'd better start running. Our modern lifestyles certainly teach us that running is what life is really about. Life is about doing, achieving, competing, winning. Now, while there's certainly much running for survival in the natural world, Herb Cohen's anecdote holds only a partial truth. Most strikingly, it fails to recognize that resting and play, not activity, is often at the heart of the animal kingdom. Lions and gazelles certainly need to run often, but most of their lives are spent lazing around, playing amongst themselves, or in the case of the gazelles, grazing on the plains. In a sense, that's what we need to recover. We need to recover time, time to stop and stare, time to be still, time to listen, time to appreciate the joys of life, however fleeting they may seem during our suffering. Time just to be. The oft-inebriated actor Richard Harris is said to have been asked by a policeman why he was lying in the middle of a street in London at 3 a.m. Well, came his apocryphal answer, I've heard that the world spins around, so I thought if I stay here long enough, my house will go past. During difficult periods of our lives, we too need to just take time out, time to stop and let the world spin around us. After all, growth still happens when we're doing nothing. Growth still happens in our times of darkness. Growth still happens in our times of silence. Growth still happens in our times of waiting. However difficult waiting is for us, it does afford us the opportunity just to stop and stare. And if we're willing to search for them, it will provide moments, however brief, when God can break through and touch us. Winters can certainly be long and cold. They can be painful, but signs of spring will always burst forth. The paradox is that God's presence can be sensed even in his seeming absence. The Welsh poet R.S. Thomas writes, as I had always known, he would come unannounced, remarkable merely for his absence of clamour. However dark, however long our Holy Saturday seems, and however deep the nails of suffering have pierced our palms, we can find God if only we know where and how to search. As Psalm 57 puts it, I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until this time of trouble has passed. Now, the concept of growth through our long wait of suffering is, of course, not specifically Christian. Other world religions, contemporary psychology, secular culture in general recognizes that meaning, formation, development can be forged through our trials and troubles. I remember watching the film Nixon, where Anthony Hopkins plays the character, or the former president, Richard Nixon. And he says, it's only when you've been in the deepest valley will you ever know how magnificent is the highest mountain. It's only when you've been in the deepest valley will you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. The uniqueness of the Christian response to suffering, though, is found in the centrality of God's love, of God's grace. And then we find another paradox. The tears and tragedy of the cross is a sign of God's love for us, precisely because it guarantees his loving presence in our tears, in our tragedies. God is love. And just a glimpse of that love can powerfully illuminate any darkness that we're going through. As the poet Henry Vaughan wrote, and here in dust and dirt, oh, here the lilies of his love appear. Oh, here in the dust and dirt, oh, here the lilies of his love appear. Nothing, of course, can completely take away the darkness of difficult waiting. But in all our waiting, faith can make a difference. Jesus can make our darkness lighter. Jesus can make our heavy load lighter. In this sense, waiting doesn't always have to be so frustrating and painful. After all, there are 2 times of waiting in the church calendar, Lent and, of course, now, Advent. And both have something in common. They end in new life and in joy. Now, interestingly, almost all the verses in the Bible that mention waiting don't relate it to heaviness or pain or oppression. Instead, they challenge us to view our waiting in a different way, relating waiting to hope. Perhaps that could be called active waiting, as our waiting helps us to truly find the kingdom in our everyday lives. Not that this active waiting will necessarily come naturally to us. Sometimes our waiting is actually when we're looking forward in anticipation to a good event. And that can lead us to live our lives in the future rather than enjoy the gift of waiting. It once dawned on me that I'd spent so much time thinking how I was looking forward to the next stage of development in my children's development, to when they learnt to crawl. And then I looked forward to when they would walk. And then I looked forward to when they would talk. And then I looked forward to when they'd actually enjoy watching football with me. I was looking at photos of my children recently, and I realized how much I'd missed of their development by simply looking into the future all the time. And I now challenge myself to appreciate where they are now. You could call it resting in the waiting for the next stage, rather than wishing that the next stage would come quickly. But there are other times, of course, when our waiting's not to do with anticipation, but rather we're forced to wait due to illness or due to a traumatic event. The lockdowns as the result of COVID-19, for example, have been putting all our lives on hold. While such waiting can be difficult and painful, we can still wait actively when we're facing adversity. I remember during an intense period of pain after a back injury I had a number of years back, I had to wait almost 12 months for an operation. As a result, for that time, I was laid up in bed for most of the day, and I'd just venture out for short daily strolls. But I taught myself to truly appreciate those walks, to appreciate the beauty of nature, the conversation of friends who accompanied me, the silence when I walked alone, or the uplifting music when I took my iPod. This was all God at work. And in spite of my continuing pain, I couldn't help but celebrate God's wonderful, mysterious, and holy gift of life. So we can aim to draw closer to God's love in the midst of our suffering. Pain may well remind us that we are alive, but love reminds us why we are alive. And so we need to retrain our minds to recognize those times in our daily lives when God's light breaks through the darkness. Times up to now we may have taken for granted or ignored. And those moments have a cumulative ability to transform, to illuminate, to bring us hope. Held as a hostage for many years in a dark room in Beirut, Brian Keenan recalls how he made a candle from small pieces of wax and string from his clothing fibers. He later wrote, "Quietly, calmly, a sense of victory welled up in me, and I thought to myself without saying it, they haven't beaten us yet. We can blot out their darkness." Light, of course, doesn't avoid darkness. Rather, it confronts it head on. In our churches on Christmas Day, we'll hear read the prologue from John's Gospel, which states, "The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it," or "the darkness has not overcome it." And so it is with love. Love's concern is not the avoidance of suffering, but rather the transformation of suffering as our painful experiences become productive and strengthen us. Jesus certainly knew the existence of evil and suffering. He knew it was a mystery to humankind. He would have been well acquainted with the book of Job, with the Psalms of sorrow, and he stood before his people as the suffering servant of Isaiah. Yet Jesus was more concerned to proclaim the mystery of love than to give hollow platitudes about the mystery of suffering. Love, like suffering, cannot truly be explained. It can, though, be experienced. In all your waiting, whatever you're going through at the moment, whatever difficulty you're facing, however uncertain the future feels, my prayer for you all is that God's light breaks through and you find ways of experiencing his love